When the Carolina Panthers traded for Bryce Young last year, the hope was that he was going to be their answer at quarterback. And so far up to this point in his career, he has looked like the complete opposite. He's looked like a bust. And now everybody's looking back at that trade and they're saying that it's one of the worst draft day trades of all time to trade up for a quarterback. But you got to ask yourself, what went wrong in that trade for Bryce Young? What did Carolina miss? Or what did they not do that made this trade look like a whiff? Well, I'll tell you this. Anytime you're going to draft a quarterback with the number 1 pick and you're giving up so many assets to draft a guy like Bryce Young, number 1 overall, wouldn't it make more sense to prioritize the offensive side of the football? And instead of prioritizing, giving Bryce Young playmakers, they decided to trade away what potentially could have been his go-to wide receiver this year. Not even potentially, it would have been his go-to wide receiver this year, and that would have been DJ Moore. They gave him to Chicago. They should have never traded away DJ Moore. That made no sense to me. If you're going to invest this much capital into a young QB, you got to keep a guy like DJ Moore around. And he would have been a perfect fit for Bryce Young because you don't have to give him the ball just strictly by throwing it downfield to him. You can give him the ball by bubble screens, slants. DJ Moore, you just got to put the ball in his hands and allow him to make things happen. That's the kind of receiver that a guy like Bryce Young needs. Somebody who can just get open and just is an all-around playmaker. You see, if you were going to invest in a young quarterback and give up all this many assets to get him, it would have made sense to also put that same amount of priority on making sure that this dude was going to be walking into an offense that you at least had a couple of playmakers around him. Adam Thielen and DJ Moore would have been a really solid 1-2 punch at wide receiver for Bryce Young to throw the football to. But instead, you trade him away when the guy who you should have traded away to Chicago, who I'm pretty sure Chicago would have took, would have been Brian Burns. And the Rams reportedly were going to give you 2 first-rounders for Brian Burns, but instead, you decided to keep him. And that never made any sense to me. Like, I get it that pass rusher is one of the most important positions in the National Football League. It's a reason why these pass rushers get paid so much money. But Brian Burns is a really good pass rusher, but he's not an elite pass rusher. He's not a Nick Bosa, a Michael Parsons, or a TJ Watt. He's a B+ pass rusher, which should have made him expendable for trade. And if you were going to trade up for a guy like Bryce Young, it would have made more sense to keep your best player on offense, that being DJ Moore, and getting rid of your best player in defense and Brian Burns, and going that direction. Because if you're prioritizing developing a young quarterback, then making sure that he has a go-to wide receiver should have been prioritized. You should have never traded away DJ Moore. Brian Burns should have been the dude who got traded to Chicago in that package to get Bryce Young. Yes, nobody wanted to see Brian Burns go, but it just made more sense. You're going to draft a young quarterback and get rid of the best receiver that he could have been throwing to? That makes no sense. How is Brian Burns going to make Bryce Young any better? He's not. You can always get another good pass rusher. You may not be able to find a B+ pass rusher like Brian Burns, but there's plenty of solid pass rushers that you could have signed in free agency. You see, like, if Brian Burns would have got traded to Chicago, they would have took that. You could make the excuse and say, well, JT, like, they wanted DJ Moore. They needed a pass rusher also. There's a reason why they traded for Montez Sweat and they extended him immediately, because pass rusher was a big need for them, just as big as a wide receiver was. But they would have took Brian Burns too, because he would have also been a really good trade target for them, because they needed the pass rusher. So you couldn't have went wrong with trading any of those two players, and DJ Moore or Brian Burns. They would have took either one. It's just that you gave them the wrong one. You should have gave them Brian Burns. If they would have called you and be like, hey, bro, like, we want DJ Moore in any trade, be like, we're not trying to give up DJ Moore, but we'll give you Brian Burns. You mean to tell me they wouldn't have took that? Brian Burns is a really good pass rusher. If you are going to draft a young quarterback, you should have made sure that you gave him a true number 1 wide receiver to throw the football to. That's the biggest mistake that the Carolina Panthers made. And it's a really big one that I'm pretty sure if they had the chance to go back and redo, they would definitely trade Brian Burns instead of DJ Moore. DJ Moore has been an all-pro receiver this year. He's damn near been a top 3, top 5 wide receiver. And with him and Adam Thielen on the same team, that offense would have looked way more better than what it did. Like, I felt so bad for Bryce Young watching him against the Jacksonville Jaguars with his little hands smash the tablet down. It didn't even look like the tablet even broke. He probably smashed that tablet down with 3 out of 10 force. What they did to Bryce Young was an absolute travesty. This dude is a great quarterback. All right, well, he looked like a great quarterback prospect. I can't say he's a great quarterback because he hasn't looked like that this year. He's looked awful. But when he was coming out of Alabama, he was a generational prospect, and I will live and die on that statement. He carried Alabama on his back. Even Nick Saban said it. He said that we were too Bryce Young dependent. That's why Nick Saban made all those sweeping changes on his coaching staff. And that's why they changed the philosophy. They went from Bryce Young to now being a complementary style football team. Bryce Young, if he was on any other team, like the Houston Texans or anybody else that prioritized the offensive side of the football, he would have had a way better rookie season. Carolina didn't prioritize the offense, which was stupid. Because if you're going to trade up this much assets to get a guy like this, why wouldn't you have kept your best receiver? It would have just made more sense to give Chicago Brian Burns. Well, JT, you don't know if Chicago would have took Brian Burns, bro. They traded for Montez Sweat. If you would have offered Brian Burns to sweeten that deal instead of DJ Moore, they would have took that too because they needed a pass rusher too. And Brian Burns would have definitely improved that defense early in the season and never would have had to make the trade for Montez Sweat. They could have just gave up a second-round pick for maybe T. Higgins, who was about to be a free agent, or Jerry Jeudy. They would have figured out the wide receiver position. They probably could have just drafted one with the pick that you would have given them. Hell, they could have drafted Marvin Harrison Jr., number 1 with that pick. But you see, with you opting to not prioritize offense and getting rid of your best player on offense that Bryce Young could have been throwing the football to, you put Bryce Young at a major disadvantage. There's nothing a guy like this can do behind a terrible offensive line and wide receivers that can't separate. And Adam Thielen being your best wide receiver at 80 years old is really problematic. On a championship caliber football team, Adam Thielen probably is a wide receiver 2 at best. All right, now Kansas City definitely could use Adam Thielen. Nobody's denying that. But I mean, Carolina really messed up giving up DJ Moore. Like, they should have traded Brian Burns. That would have just made so much sense. You should have just prioritized building up that offense. Why would it make sense to take away from the offense? Like, why would you trade away your franchise cornerstone on that side of football if you knew you were taking Bryce Young, number 1 overall? So that's what I think was the biggest mistake the Carolina Panthers made when they traded for Bryce Young.